$487,000. That is the gap between two people who earn the exact same paycheck. Meet John. John is a buyer. He did everything the world told him to do. He saved for 6 years, put 20% down, and bought a $420,000 house. Now meet Carla. Carla earns the same salary, in the same city, on the same street. But Carla rented. Everyone told her she was throwing her money away. Her own father said it to her face. Rent is a trap, he told her. You are paying someone else's mortgage. And for 30 years, John was certain he was the smart one. He had the deed. He had the equity. He had the thing you are supposed to want. But when you run the numbers, and I mean actually run them, one of these two people ends up with $487,000 more than the other. And it is not the person you would bet on. Today, we do the math that nobody wants to do. Not the realtor, not your parents, not the loan officer smiling across the desk. Just the real, unglamorous, hidden math. This is the biggest financial decision most people will ever make. A house is not a $200 phone. It is a 30-year, $500,000 commitment. Get the frame wrong, and the mistake does not cost you a little. It costs you a house. And here is the uncomfortable part. Most people never actually do this calculation. They feel it. They inherit it. Buying is what responsible adults do, so they buy. Renting is for people who have not figured it out yet, so they apologize for renting. But feelings are not math. The story you were told about your money was written by people who earn a commission when you sign. A realtor earns nothing when you rent. A bank earns nothing when you stay put. The entire machine is built to move you toward the closing table. That does not make buying wrong. It just means the loudest voices in this decision are not neutral. So today we strip all of that away. We are going to follow John and Carla for 30 years, dollar for dollar. We will count the down payment, the interest, the taxes, the repairs, and the one cost almost everyone forgets. Then we will see who is actually richer at the end. Not who feels richer, who is richer. The difference between the right call and the wrong one here is not a rounding error. It is an entire second retirement account, quietly won or quietly lost. Let's keep this fair. So let us build these two lives carefully, because the details are where the truth hides. John and Carla both take home the same money. They both have $96,000 saved in the bank. Same start line, same city, same paycheck. In early 2026, the median American home costs about $420,000. That is the house John buys. He puts down 20%, which is $84,000. Then he pays closing costs. Most people forget closing costs entirely. They run 2 to 5% of the purchase price. On a $420,000 home, John pays roughly $12,600 just to sign the papers. So before John owns a single brick, $96,600 has left his account. His savings are gone, converted into a down payment and a pile of fees. John now carries a mortgage of $336,000. In 2026, a 30-year fixed mortgage runs between 6.5% and 6.8%. We will use 6.75% right in the middle. At that rate, John's principal and interest payment is about $2,179 a month. But that is not what it costs to own the house. Property taxes average about 1% of the value a year, another $300, and $50 a month. Homeowners insurance adds roughly $150. Maintenance, the cost nobody budgets for, runs about 1% of the home's value every year. That is another $350 a month, whether you spend it in a quiet year or all at once when the roof finally fails. Add it up. John's true monthly cost to own is not $2,179. It is closer to $3,030 a month. Now Carla. Carla rents the same style of home on the same block for $2,200 a month. Her father is horrified. But Carla is not just renting. Carla is running a plan. She takes the $96,600 that John poured into his down payment and closing costs, and she invests all of it in a low-cost index fund. Then every single month, she takes the difference between John's true cost and her rent, about $830, and she invests that too, automatically before she can spend it. John buys a house, Carla buys the stock market, same income, same start. Two completely different bets. Now let us find out which bet actually wins. Here is what nobody tells you about a down payment. It is not free. Everyone treats $84,000 as if it simply transforms into a house and quietly disappears from the conversation. But that money had a job it could have done. Invested in the market, $84,000 does not sit still. Over the last 30 years, the stock market has returned about 10% a year before inflation, and around 7% after it. Let us be conservative and use 7%. At 7%, money doubles roughly every 10 years. So Carla's down payment alone, that $96,600, does something quietly violent over 3 decades. It doubles, and then it doubles again, and then it nearly doubles a third time. This is the cost economists call opportunity cost, and it is the most ignored number in the entire rent versus buy debate. When John spent that cash on a house, he did not just spend the cash. He gave up everything that cash could have become. That is the first hidden line on the bill, and it is enormous. Most people never see it because it never shows up on a statement. At 7%, that $96,600 alone would grow to more than $700,000 in 30 years, without Carla ever adding another single cent. It is the money that was never allowed to exist. Now here is what actually happens after you get the keys. The financial writer Ramit Sethi has a line that should be taped to every buyer's mirror. Rent, he says, is the maximum you will pay. A mortgage is the minimum. Think about that for a second. When Carla signs a lease, $2,200 is the worst case. It is the ceiling. When John signs a mortgage, his payment is the floor. Everything else is extra, and the extras are relentless. Sethi calls them phantom costs, and he estimates they add 30 to 50% on top of the mortgage payment. These are the costs that do not build a single dollar of equity. Property taxes, homeowners insurance, the new water heater, the roof, the tree that falls in, the yard during a storm. According to an analysis by Zillow and Thumbtack, the hidden costs of owning a home now reach about $15,900 a year for the average American homeowner. In expensive metros like New York and San Francisco, those invisible costs climb past $24,000 a year. That is not the mortgage. That is on top of the mortgage. $15,900 a year is $1,300 a month evaporating into the house, year after year, buying you exactly nothing you can ever resell. Renters do not pay these. When Carla's water heater dies, she sends a text and goes back to bed. When John's water heater dies, he pays for it, he installs it, and it adds nothing to his net worth. So how do you cut through all of this in 10 seconds? There is a shortcut, and it is the single most useful tool in this entire debate. It comes from a portfolio manager named Ben Felix, and it is called the 5% rule. Here is how it works. Take the price of the home, multiply it by 5%, then divide by 12. That number is the true annual cost of owning expressed monthly once you account for the things people forget. Where does the 5% come from? It is roughly 1% for property tax, 1% for maintenance, and 3% for the opportunity cost of your money tied. Up in the walls, let us run it on John's home. $420,000 times 5% is $21,000 a year. Divide by 12 and you get $1,750 a month. That is your break-even line. Here is the rule. If you can rent the equivalent home for less than that number, renting is mathematically the better deal. If renting costs more than that number, buying wins. Carla rents for $2,200. That is above the $1,750 line, which suggests John's purchase is not crazy. But watch how fast this flips. In a city where that same house costs $600,000, the 5% line jumps to $2,500 a month. If rent in that city is still $2,200, renting suddenly wins by a mile. The house did not change. The math did. One number decides everything, and almost nobody bothers to calculate it. Here is what most people never do. They never look at how a mortgage actually gets paid. When John sends in that $2,179 payment in year 1, he assumes he is buying his house. He is mostly buying the bank's patience. In the early years of a 30-year loan, the overwhelming majority of each payment is pure interest. On a $336,000 loan at 6.75%, John pays almost $1,900 of interest in the very first month. Less than $300 actually reduces what he owes. He is renting money from the bank, and the rent on that money is brutal at the start. Over the full 30 years, if John never refinances and never moves, he will pay more than $400,000 in interest alone. Read that again. On a $336,000 loan, the interest by itself is over $400,000. He nearly pays for the entire house twice. Now, some of that is offset because inflation makes future payments cheaper in real terms, and that fixed payment becomes a smaller burden as his income rises over the decades. That is a genuine advantage of buying, and we are keeping this fair, so it counts. But the interest is real. It is enormous. And it is the second phantom cost hiding in plain sight on the amortization schedule that almost no buyer ever opens. But John has a card to play, and he plays it fast. My mortgage interest is tax deductible, he says. The government is helping me pay for this house. And this is where a decades-old myth quietly costs people money. Here is what nobody tells you about the mortgage interest deduction. Most homeowners never actually use it. To deduct your mortgage interest, you have to itemize your taxes. But the standard deduction is now so large that the vast majority of Americans, well over 80% of all filers, take the standard deduction and never itemize at all. That means for most buyers, the mortgage interest deduction is worth exactly $0. It is a benefit they were promised and never receive. Even for John, who might itemize in the early years when his interest is highest, the deduction only saves him a fraction of what he pays. He does not get his interest back. He gets a small slice of it back and only on the amount that clears the standard deduction first. Renters hear none of this. Carla takes the very same standard deduction John is probably taking, without spending a single dollar on interest to earn it. So the tax argument, the one buyers reach for the moment the numbers get tight, is far weaker than the sales pitch. For most people, it is not a discount. It is a story about a discount, and you cannot spend a story. Now for the belief at the center of the whole thing. My house will go up in value. And it probably will. But here is what nobody tells you about home appreciation. It is far weaker than the story suggests. Over the long run, home prices in America have risen only slightly, faster than inflation, historically around 3 to 4% a year. The stock market over that same long run has returned about 10% a year before inflation. That gap is the entire ballgame. Let us watch it play out. John's $420,000 home, growing at a modest 3% a year for 30 years, becomes worth about $1,020,000. That sounds incredible. $1 million house. But Carla's money, invested at 7% after inflation over the same 30 years, is doing something the house simply cannot match, because 7% compounding crushes 3% compounding over 3 decades. And remember, John's house did not grow for free. He paid over $400,000 in interest and around $15,000 a year in phantom costs just to hold it. Carla's index fund charges her a few dollars a year and never once asks her to replace a roof. The house appreciates, the portfolio compounds. Those are not the same word, and the difference between them is measured in hundreds of thousands of dollars. So does buying ever win? Absolutely, and here is exactly when. Buying is a bet that only pays off with time. Every time you buy or sell a home, you burn cash on closing costs, agent commissions, and moving trucks. That 6% selling fee at the very end alone eats $60,000 on $1 million house. So the longer you stay, the more those one-time costs get spread out, and the more the fixed mortgage pays off against forever rising rents. The typical American buyer does not break even against renting until about 6 years in. Stay less than 5 years, and buying is almost always the wrong financial move. But here is the part that should stop you cold. In some major cities, the break-even point is not 6 years. In Seattle, Los Angeles, and Austin, buyers may not break even for 17 to 23 years. And in San Francisco and San Jose, a renter who invests the difference comes out ahead even after 30 full years. 30 years and renting still wins. That is not an opinion. That is the price-to-rent ratio doing exactly what the math says it must. There is one more cost of buying that never shows up in dollars, and it might be the most expensive of all. A house is an anchor. When John buys, he is not just spending money, he is chaining himself to a single zip code. Say a job offer lands in another state paying $20,000 more a year. Carla packs a truck and takes it. John has to sell a house first, and selling takes months and burns tens of thousands in fees. Say the neighborhood changes, or the neighbor from hell moves in next door. Carla waits out her lease and quietly leaves. John is stuck, and here is the cruelest version of all. In a recession, the people forced to sell their homes are often the ones who just lost a job, selling at the worst possible moment, into the worst possible market, right? When prices are down. Renters do not get margin called on their apartment. Owning concentrates your single biggest asset and your paycheck in the very same place. So when one breaks, the other often breaks with it. Economists call the freedom to move optionality, and it has real financial value. Carla is paying a slightly higher monthly cost, yes. But part of what she is buying with that difference is the ability to say yes to her own life without asking a real estate agent for permission first. Which brings us to the one number that quietly runs this entire decision. It is called the price-to-rent ratio. You take the price of a home and divide it by the annual cost to rent the very same home. A low ratio means buying is cheap relative to renting. A high ratio means renting is the bargain and buying is a luxury you pay dearly for. And here's the statistic that reframes everything. In 2026, an analysis of 838 American cities found that in only 95 of them was it actually cheaper to buy than to rent. 95 out of 838. In the other 743 cities, the math quietly favored renting. In places like Detroit and Cleveland, buying can save you 40 to 60% over renting, and buying is the obvious move. But in San Jose, the price-to-rent ratio hit 55, and renting saves more than $8,500 a month. Same country, opposite answers. The question was never simply rent versus buy. The question is always, what is the ratio where you actually live? Ask that one question and the fog clears instantly. It is the difference between a smart purchase and a slow 30-year mistake. So let us finally run John and Carla's 30 years all the way to the finish line. After 3 decades, John owns his home free and clear. At 3% growth, it is worth about $1,020,000. He sells, and the agent takes roughly 6%, about $60,000. John walks away with close to $960,000. That is real money, and it is a genuine win. John did well. Nobody is laughing at John. Now Carla? Her $96,600 head start, invested at 7% for 30 years, grows to more than $700,000 all on its own. Then add the $830 a month she invested on top of it, compounding the entire time. Carla's portfolio crosses $1,400,000. Set them side by side. John, the responsible buyer, ends with about $960,000. Carla, the renter everyone pitied, ends with about $1,447,000. The difference is roughly $487,000, and it belongs to the renter. The woman who was throwing her money away threw it straight into the market instead, and the market threw it back nearly $500,000 heavier. Same paycheck, same 30 years. One of them signed a mortgage, the other signed up for the market, and $500,000 separated them at the end. But now I have to tell you the part that ruins the clean ending. Because there is a statistic that seems to prove the exact opposite of everything I just showed you. According to the Federal Reserve, the median homeowner in America has a net worth of about $400,000. The median renter has a net worth of about $10,400. Homeowners are worth almost 40 times more than renters. 40 times! So if renting and investing is so clearly smart, why are homeowners crushing renters in the real world by that kind of margin? This is the moment most people stop thinking and just buy. But here is the answer, and it is the whole secret of this video. It is not the house. It is the discipline. Look closely at what Carla actually had to do to win. She had to invest $96,000 instead of spending it. Then she had to invest $830 more every single month. For 360 months in a row, and never once raid that account for a vacation, a car, or an emergency. That is the entire catch. Carla only beats John, if Carla is a machine. And almost nobody is a machine. Study after study shows that when renting is cheaper, most renters do not invest the difference. They absorb it into their lifestyle. The gap becomes a nicer car, a bigger trip, a little more spending, and 30 years later, there is no portfolio at all. There is just a lifetime of receipts. A mortgage is different, and this is the uncomfortable genius of it. A mortgage is a forced savings plan disguised as a bill. You cannot skip it. Miss it and you lose the roof over your head, so you pay it month after month, in good years and bad, and equity quietly accumulates whether you have willpower or not. The bank becomes the discipline you could not provide yourself. So the 40 times net worth gap is not proof that houses are magic wealth machines. It is proof that the average person will not invest on their own, and the mortgage forces them to. Correlation is not causation. Homeowners are not richer because they bought. They are richer because buying made them save, and saving is what actually built the wealth. Which means the real question was never rent versus buy. The real question is the one almost nobody asks out loud. Are you Carla, or do you just think you are? Be honest, because your whole financial life turns on that single answer. A house does not build wealth. It builds discipline, and discipline is what builds wealth. So where does that leave you, standing at your own version of this exact decision? It leaves you with far better questions than the ones you were handed. Do not ask whether renting is throwing money away, because that question was written by someone who profits from your answer. Ask instead what the price-to-rent ratio is in your city, because that single number decides more than every opinion combined. Do not ask whether buying is the responsible, grown-up thing to do. Ask whether you will honestly invest the difference if you rent, or whether the mortgage is the only savings plan you will ever actually follow. If you are Carla, disciplined, automatic, and relentless, then in most American cities, renting and investing quietly wins. If you are like most of us, and the money would slip through your fingers, then the house that forces you to save might be the best decision you ever make. even at a higher cost. There is no universal answer here, and anyone who hands you one is selling something. The most important financial decision you can make is knowing the difference between a strategy that is right for you and a strategy that is right for someone else. So run the numbers for your city, your rent, your timeline, and your honest level of discipline. Then make the decision that matches your reality, not your father's, not a realtor's, and not a stranger's on the internet. If this showed you a number you had never seen before, subscribe to Desmond Wealth, where we break down the hidden math behind the financial decisions you face every day. Because the goal was never to own a house, and it was never to rent one either. The goal was always to own your money, and that starts the moment you finally run the math yourself.